Climate change is most definitely in the news. Secondary school students from all over the world have been holding school strikes protesting a lack of policy tackling a problem that will affect their future and their children's future. A group of students from Oxford recently started a petition asking for climate change to be made a core part of the national curriculum in England. We can interpret and start to understand climate change in a balanced and scientific way by introducing a strange group of plants that have been around for hundreds of millions of years, the club mosses, horsetails and quillworts. Just contemplate for a moment. If every millimetre is equivalent to 100,000 years and every centimetre is equivalent to 1,000,000 years, then a metre becomes 100 million years. Carbon dioxide has been present in the atmosphere of Earth since it condensed from a ball of hot gases following the Earth's formation from the explosion of a huge star about 5 billion years ago. One of the gases that remained from that explosion was carbon dioxide. 5 billion years ago, in our metric timeline, using millimetres, centimetres and metres, equates to 50 kilometres. Now, if you're stood in the centre of somewhere like, say, Reading, and you're thinking about 50 kilometres, that takes you to places like London, so it's the space between London and Reading. Epsom is about 50 kilometres away from Reading. Guildford is 36 kilometres, so not quite right. Winchester is 49 kilometres. About 2.5 billion years ago, the very earliest single-celled plants developed the ability to photosynthesize. They started creating glucose and oxygen from the carbon dioxide and water in their surroundings. And they did it using light from the sun. 425 million years ago, though, that's 4 meters 25 centimeters on our timeline, the first plants crept out of the water and onto land. And those plants brought about changes that led to the development of all life on land. This had an absolutely huge impact on the atmosphere as life developed. Carbon dioxide was consumed by plants, locking it up and cooling the planet. Carbon dioxide plays a really important role in climate because it's one of the atmospheric greenhouse gases which keep the Earth's surface about 33 degrees warmer than the minus 18 degrees Celsius temperature it would be if carbon dioxide was not present. The first vascular plants, those with vessel elements that allow them to move water around their system, didn't evolve for another 55 million years after the first plants crept out of the water onto land. During the Carboniferous period, which ran from 360 million years ago, so 3.6 metres on our timeline, to 300 million years ago, 3 metres on our timeline, plants started to capture so much carbon from the atmosphere that the atmosphere cooled quite significantly. The name Carboniferous means coal-bearing and derives from the Latin words carbo and ferro. Carbo, coal, and ferro, I carry. During this period, the ancient relatives of the club mosses, quillworts and horsetails, plants that still occur today, grew to up to 30 metres tall. Using different structural forms and using different forms of photosynthesis, they locked up so much carbon from the atmosphere. And as I said, the planet cooled, caused glaciation events and atmospheric oxygen levels that allowed both vertebrates and invertebrates to attain huge proportions. As the greenery of this time died and sunk to the bottom of the wet areas where it grew, it partially decayed and turned into peat. The wetlands dried out. Other materials then covered the peat, and with heat, pressure and time, that peat transformed the carbohydrates they were made of into hydrocarbons, coal. All this meant that by 20 million years ago, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration was down to below 300 molecules in every million molecules of air, or 300 parts per million. Carbon dioxide levels plummeted. Only since the Industrial Revolution has CO2 exceeded that, and it currently stands at about 411.77 parts per million. Humans did not appear on the planet until about 200,000 years ago. That's 2 millimeters on our timeline. And atmospheric CO2 did not exceed 300 parts per million until the Industrial Revolution, 1760 to 1840, which is amazingly less than 30 nanometers on our timeline. The Industrial Revolution brought with it massive emissions from combustion of fossil fuels, coal and oil. The coal we burn today got its start with those club mosses, quillworts and horsetails over 300 million years ago. And the carbon entering the atmosphere from our use of fossil fuels is the same carbon that was locked up by these plants' early relatives. The real challenge now is, how do we relock up that carbon? It's so important that we help people to understand the history of carbon on this planet in order for them to be able to understand climate change and what they can do to help reduce the impacts of climate change in the future. It's amazing for me to think that over 450 million years, 4 meters 50 on our timeline, of carbon being locked up and stored in the form of coal can be undone in such a short period of time, that's having such a massive impact